Hey there, and welcome to You Talk. We connect with extraordinary people across Canada and ask them about their stories, passions, and experiences. I'm your host, Ryan Funk. When you live in Winnipeg, it may seem like Manitoba is a city province. Once you head past that perimeter, you quickly realize a lot of southern Manitoba is farmland. Let's take a deep dive into one group of early farmers, the Mennonites. We have Conrad from the Mennonite Archives to share their history with us.
My name is Conrad, and I'm the archivist at the Mennonite Heritage Archives on the campus of Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg.
So I guess the important question is, what are the Mennonite archives? What were they? When were they established? And what, as an archivist, what do you do there?
These particular archives were established here in Winnipeg in 1933. They were created out of a sense of loss, actually. There was a Mennonite archive in Russia, and in the mid-1920s, it was confiscated by the secret police. And this archive was an attempt to start over. So today, our archive responds to over 100 requests for information a month. If you stack all our paper on top of each other, it's higher than the CN Tower. So it's over half a kilometer high. It's 600 meters of materials that we have. And we have all sorts of people that come to our archive to use this material. We have scholars, genealogists, family historians, lawyers, documentary filmmakers, journalists, a whole slew of people coming using the archive to answer important questions.
Yeah, it's one of those things you never know you need it until you're doing a project like that.
Yeah, often archives kind of spring up out of this anniversary events, or people want to tell a story and they realize, well, where are these documents? Where are these stories? And so then they spend time collecting the materials. They write their project, write their book, and then what are we going to do with this material? Well, we should start an archive is often how things like this start.
And I think it's just so interesting, like the history of Mennonites, and we'll go into a little bit more detail, but just exploring some of these museums out in the prairie communities, like the Miami Museum and other things like that. It is just so interesting seeing life of what these early immigrants and farmers was like. So the important question, who were the early Mennonites that first came here to Manitoba?
Mennonites grew out of the Protestant Reformation in Western Europe in the 1500s. There was a man by the name of Menno Simons who became a leader in this Protestant group. His followers were called Mennonites after Menno Simons. Many were from Dutch, German, Swiss background. They were a Christian group who believed in nonviolence. They believed that baptism and becoming a member of a church happened as an adult. It didn't happen earlier. And the importance of community in church making decisions, that all voices had a right to be heard. And for some of these beliefs, they weren't always welcome in different parts of Europe. So they moved around a lot. And the first Mennonites went to Russia in 1789. And then about 100 years later, in the 1870s, laws were changing in Russia and now in what is Ukraine. The Russian government wanted more control over schools, and they wanted to revoke the exemption from military service that was promised to the Mennonites. So some Mennonites started looking for, okay, so what are our options? And a delegation was sent out to North America in 1873, and they checked out Manitoba. And the Canadian government wanted more people in the province. They wanted farmers. Treaty 1 had been signed. And so the government produced a document, this document here,
nice.
In 1873, that highlighted and laid out, if you guys come to Manitoba, this is what you get. This is our promises. This is kind of our contract with you. And in there was land and help settlement. But for the Mennonites, what was really important was exemption from military service, and they could control their own schools. Those are very important things. So about a third of the Mennonites left Russia in the 1870s. 10,000 went to the United States, but 7,000 came to Manitoba because of this letter, because of the exemption from military service, and because of they could run their own schools. Mm-hmm. And so 2 parcels of land was set aside for their settlement, their exclusive settlement. So one on the east side of the Red River in the Steinbach area, it was called the East Reserve, little creative name. And the other settlement was in the Altona-Winkler area, the West Reserve, west side of the river. And the first few years were very difficult. But after the first few years, early had to deal with early frost and too wet conditions. And so farming was really difficult getting going. After that, they started to really flourish and expand. And they grew out of those reserves and moved around the province, and you start moving to Saskatchewan and Alberta. Then during World War I, Canada was at war with Germany. The Canadian government honored their promise of exemption from military service, but the Canadian public was not very happy with the way the Mennonites were not supporting the war effort the way that they thought they should. And as a way of making Mennonites more patriotic, the governments in Saskatchewan and Manitoba introduced compulsory attendance for schools. So Mennonites had to send, well, not just Mennonites, anybody in the province had to send their children to government-run schools. So the ability to run their own schools was taken away. And the government wanted more obedient citizens, and they thought education was the way to do this. Some Mennonites thought, okay, we can work with this. We'll find other ways of creating and instilling values in our community. Some resisted. And so those who resisted and didn't send their kids to school, they were jailed, they were fined, they even had farm machinery, animals, even food confiscated. So in Saskatchewan alone, there were over 4,500 prosecutions of these families that wouldn't send their kids to public school because they said, government, you promised us that we could run our own schools. Well, this went on, and so finally, this group that was resisting said, this isn't working for us. Canada's not a good place for us. And so 7,000 moved to Mexico and Paraguay, starting in 1922, 100 years ago this year. And so that's how those communities in Latin America first got started. So these people are moving out starting in 1922, but the Russian Revolution has happened in Russia, and that's created a lot of upheaval. So between 1923 and 1930, you have a second wave of migration of Mennonites into Manitoba from Russia. So 20,000 come to Canada between 23 and 1930. Another group, another wave post-World War II come. And then, like you were saying, people in the 1990s started coming back from Mexico and Paraguay to Manitoba. And then another complicating or factor is that you start having people coming out of Europe in the 1990s to Canada. So yeah, there's a lot of moving around and happening.
The most interesting, like based on the history of some Mennonites had to be assimilated within the government-run school systems, especially like out in Winkler, Altona, the Pembina Valley region. You can definitely see the cultural differences between people who were put through the government schools and then people coming over now. There's very difference between at least those European Mennonites.
Yeah, the Mennonites today in southern Manitoba or around the province, there's a large variety. There are over 42 denominations in Canada, about 150,000 adult members in Canada, not counting kids. And some Mennonites, you can tell that they're Mennonites by the way they dress, and others you can't. In Manitoba, Calvin Gertson was our first Mennonite premier, and we have Mennonites sitting in Headingley Penitentiary. They're around the province. They're doctors, lawyers, truck drivers, carpenters, bakers, a variety of people today.
When you're talking about the different denominations of Mennonite, I know a joke often told out in the Pembina Valley is, when you disagree with someone, you just start a new church.
Yeah, you put 4 Mennonites in a room and you get 5 opinions.
It's definitely a very diverse group, and it's changed a lot over the years, specifically through missions trips. We see Mennonites all over the world now.
What I've talked about is people who have a European background, but yeah, there have always been people coming into the Mennonite community and leaving, and joining the Mennonite community for appreciating their values and how they run church. And so, yeah, there's a large Mennonite population around the world today, in part because of mission work, but also just people being in the community and wanting to join the church.
I know there can often be a little confusion around, Mennonites is like, oh, is this a culture thing? Is this a religious thing?
Yeah, it's difficult to give a short answer to that question, and people, really debate that. And in my mind, there's, kind of three categories. There's the faith category, there's the culture category, and another category that is both. So there are people who self-identify as Mennonite because of the church they attend or the values they hold. This can include people who are relatively new to the church or people who have long-standing roots in the church. Then there are people who value the culture but don't have any church affiliation anymore, but they enjoy maybe some of the food and folkways, maybe they even speak this Mennonite Low German language. And then there's people kind of who have a foot in both camps, who are both. They attend a Mennonite church and they have a long-standing appreciation of the Mennonite culture in the Mennonite community. And so, yeah, it's both culture and faith. And it's to people trying to figure it out at the beginning, it can be kind of confusing.
But I guess it's kind of in that aspect where, there was an established culture in the beginning when it was just forming, kind of taking those European influences. But since then, it's evolved.
Yeah, and it has evolved, and it will keep evolving.
Yeah, it'll keep changing.
And in Manitoba, it keeps changing every time there's a new migration group that comes in, or there's a new people joining from within the province already. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what can we learn about the history of Mennonites? Because it's something you don't often hear about in school. Like even out in the Pembina Valley, they don't, unless you're taking a Mennonite studies class, they don't really talk about, these mass migrations of people who help establish the farming communities around there.
Yeah, I think it would be great to have a class or even a whole course on Mennonite migration in our school system. That would be really good. So what can we learn? I think one of the things is the power of community. The early years is the communities that were fundamental to establishing lasting settlements on the open prairie. They had to rely on each other. These communities have established organizations to help people around the world. You have Mennonite Central Committee, Mennonite Disaster Service. They go around the world where there's a disaster, a hurricane or a tornado or earthquake or a flood, and they go and help people rebuild. Mennonite Economic Development Associates is another one, Canadian Food Grains Bank. And for a small community like the Mennonite community, they've really done a lot in helping others. And another thing about community is you need a community to maintain a culture. Mm-hmm. That's really important. Another thing we can learn is that not just from the Mennonite community, but since we're talking about Mennonites, Canada did not always have and did not always value multiculturalism. For some time, it was difficult to be different, and the process or the underlying assumption was to fit into a certain kind of mold in what you believed and how you talked and these types of things. And so some of the Mennonites resisted this, and because they were part of a community, they could resist. On your own, it's much more difficult. So that's another thing to learn from the Mennonite experience. And Mennonites have really valued peace and nonviolence. That's been a big value for them, and that's something that they've brought also to the Canadian context.
The multicultural aspect, yeah. Before it's like you had English-speaking Canada, and French-speaking Canada. If you didn't fall into either of those categories, yeah, you were an outsider. And I love seeing how it's developed multiculturalism, because it's so fun to go around and learn about other people's cultures and just the food aspect. And I think that's definitely something Mennonites can bring to the table in terms of multiculturalism, those foods. I know they're not for everyone, but man, like a good Zummerborscht.
Yeah, I love Zummerborscht. Yeah, and so everywhere the Mennonites have gone, they've kind of picked up food and folkways from where they're living, and they've kind of adapted it. And so, for example, one of the earliest ones is the Mennonite New Year's cookies called it's parcheltje.
Okay, I don't think
Parcheltje,
I've
which is
had that, but Rock and I know that.
parcheltje is like a fried raisin fritter, and they picked it up when Mennonites were living in the lowlands in the Netherlands. So the Dutch people, they create what they call oliebollen, which is a fried raisin fritter that they create for New Year's Day. And so the Mennonites have carried on that tradition to this day. And so, New Year's Eve, I was making parcheltje in my home, and there were Mennonites in Latin America, and there were Dutch people in Holland making the same thing. And so they picked up these foodways and kind of adopted them. Zommerborst, Kamsborst, Veranetje, all these things. I love them.
Like Mennonite foods can really be just a staple of kind of like world foods, kind of like put into one group a little bit.
Yeah.
We got pierogies like from Ukraine and Russia.
Right. And so Mennonite dough pockets, we call them Veranetje, have cottage cheese in them.
Mm-hmm.
And the Ukrainian pierogies often will have potato and cheese, potato and bacon, those types of staples. Whereas I grew up having just the cottage cheese. And later on, some people started putting fruit.
Blueberries, like kind of dessert. Cottage cheese pierogies, they're like my favorite, with some schmofat put over top of it.
Yeah, cream gravy.
Cream gravy. What is it? There's like, I can't remember the name of it, but for like waffles or pancakes, white sauce. Like that's good too.
Yeah, it's
I'm a bad Mennonite. I don't remember most of the name.
Yeah, I've asked people what do they call that white sauce, and people just say the white sauce. So there's one family that called it schmagus, and I don't know if that's right or not. But instead of having syrup, it was a way of making a sweet syrup out of the waffle dough, with added sugar and stuff, and then you would pour it onto the waffles.
Yeah, I remember going to a friend's house. And he's like, "Oh, here, try this." And I'm like, "What is this? I've never seen it before." I guess it's just so interesting. Yeah, the different involvement in Mennonite culture that different individuals have. Like my upbringing wasn't too much. There's some, but maybe I'd like to see a little bit more. Maybe I'll try exploring, my Mennonite heritage a little bit once everything is settled down a little bit. But what is your favorite Mennonite meal? Or
I have so many. One of my favorite comfort foods would be Kamsborst, which is a cabbage borscht. So in Ukrainians, the way I understand it, would make a beet borscht, but this is made with cabbage and tomatoes. I really enjoy that. But my all-time favorite is the cottage cheese Veranetje, cottage cheese pierogies. With some ham and some cream gravy. That's my ultimate favorite.
That's a classic meal for like your grandma to make for everyone to come over for supper.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when we go to my parents' place, and my kids always want to have Veranetje at Grandma and Grandpa's.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you work in an archive, what sort of document or information that you've come across that has just kind of like blown your mind, that you've just gotten really, really excited for?
So this one I showed you here, this I think is our most important document, this letter of invitation from the Canadian government. But there's all sorts of interesting things that I come across in the archives. Some of our oldest stuff is from the 1500s. Biggest item is a book. It's actually a Spanish Catholic music book. That's got to be 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, weighs about 50 pounds. Covers are made of wood. Binding is made with metal hinges. And it was used as a instead of off the wall singing where you project music on the wall, you'd stand in a semicircle around this music book and sing out of it. So it's not Mennonite at all, but we have it here as a way of, it's a teaching tool that people who talk about music history come and use it, but also people who talk about history of bookmaking or history of calligraphy and artistic design come and view this book. So I bring this book out a couple times every year. So that's a really cool thing. We have a book from 1551 that was used by a Mennonite midwife. That is a book of herbs. So not only does it list the plants, but also the medicinal values of this plant.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, so
that's definitely something that can apply to modern life.
Yeah. And so some of the midwifery recipes that we've done some work with is really interesting stuff. I've done a fair amount of research on conscientious objectors, those in World War II who served Canada, but not with arms. They were working in forestry or in mining or in farming to support the government and the war effort. So that's a story I find interesting and not well known. There are over 10,000 people who served Canada without weapons in World War II. And those people came from 24 different communities, not Mennonite communities, different religious communities across the country.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another interesting story that we have that I research.
Well, sounds like there's some really cool items over there.
Yeah, there are. If you like stories, this is the place to be.
So can people, can the general public visit the archive?
Yeah, absolutely. Now with COVID, we ask for people to make an appointment. So we kind of regulate who's coming in when. But yeah, the public is welcome to come on in. And the green screen I have behind me is part of my reading room. So this is what you see there is some of the periodicals that we have. And then there's that door you just see kind of off in the corner.
Yeah.
Oh, over there.
That one, right there. Yeah.
Yeah. So behind that, we call that our vault. And behind there is, 1,600 square feet of vault space where we have these documents in boxes.
That's
documents in books and all sorts of stuff.
Huh. Maybe I'm going to have to plan a friend hangout to go visit the archive sometime because it sounds just like a really, really cool place.
Yeah, it is. I really enjoy it. I learn something old every day in my job. And it's always interesting to see what kind of questions people come to the archives with and want to answer. And it's fun being part of that research process. And when people come and say, I want to know something about this topic, then I got to think for a while. Okay, so how do I find that? Because archives are not arranged like a book.
Mm-hmm.
To do archival research is different than doing book research or internet research. And because we don't have time to index everything. And so we have to create different ways of finding that information. We create contextual knowledge about the records. And so sometimes it takes a while to figure out, okay, how do you get at that question? And sometimes people are surprised that, well, you don't have anything on that, or you can't just pull that off the shelf. Like if someone wanted to find out, I'm gonna do some research on tractors. I don't have a box on tractors.
Tractors,
right?
Yeah, you got to go in and it develops your problem solving and investigative skills.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very true.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Conrad. It was great speaking with you, and hopefully we can inspire some people to come and check out the archives.
Yeah, absolutely. Come on in. We're open Monday to Friday, 8:30 to 4:30. Check out our website. We're on Instagram and Facebook as well.
Enjoying the content from You Multicultural? Why don't you subscribe to stay up to date with everything that we're doing? If you have any stories you want us to talk about or communities we should highlight, leave a comment down below or reach out to us over social media. I'm Ryan Funk. This was You Talk, and have yourself a good one.